In the freezing dawn of February 7, 1944, a German officer sat shivering in a foxhole near Anzio, Italy. He was less than 100 meters from the American lines. His trembling hands were not merely a reaction to the bitter Italian winter, which had transformed the battlefield into a wasteland of mud and ice, but a result of sheer terror. In his diary, he scribbled words that would unknowingly christen a legend. He wrote of American parachutists, whom he called devils in baggy pants. He confessed that they appeared from nowhere, striking without warning, robbing him and his men of sleep and sanity. Days later, that officer was dead. When advancing American troops recovered his body, they found the blood-stained diary in his pocket. A German-speaking sergeant translated the entry for his squad. Instead of being offended by the enemy's description, the exhausted paratroopers laughed. They passed the translation around the foxholes while artillery rained down around them. These men, who had seen their ranks decimated by weeks of relentless combat, embraced the title. They were no longer just soldiers of the 82nd Airborne. They were the Devils. This name was not earned through a single moment of glory, but through a brutal campaign of psychological and physical warfare. The diary entry became a badge of honor for the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, giving them an identity that was more valuable than any medal. It signified that they had broken the spirit of the German Wehrmacht. This is the story of how they earned that name, fighting from the heat of Sicily to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, proving that the most dangerous weapon in the war was a paratrooper who refused to quit. The story begins at Fort Benning, Georgia, in May 1942. The 504th was activated when the concept of large-scale airborne warfare was still a dangerous experiment. The volunteers were stepping into the unknown. Their training was designed to weed out the weak. 5 weeks of physical agony, running miles in the humidity, and learning to jump from aircraft at 120 miles per hour. The instructors were merciless. A single mistake meant expulsion or death. The dropout rate soared past 40%. But those who remained were forged into an elite brotherhood. They were young, fit, and incredibly arrogant, looking down on the legs. Regular infantry who had to walk into battle. Leading this aggressive new breed was Colonel Reuben Tucker. At only 31, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Army. A West Point graduate who had initially failed math, Tucker was defined by stubborn determination. He despised paperwork and loved combat. Legend has it that he once threw a crate full of disciplinary charges into the Mediterranean Sea rather than process them, endearing him to his men forever. General James Megellas later called Tucker the finest combat regimental commander of the war. Tucker led from the front, jumping with his men and making split-second decisions under fire. He instilled 2 core principles in the 504th: strike and hold. Attack violently and never give up ground. By the time they boarded ships for North Africa in April 1943, the regiment believed they were invincible. They were about to learn that war does not care about confidence. The regiment's first combat drop into Sicily in July 1943 was meant to be their baptism of fire. Instead, it became a massacre by their own side. On the night of July 11th, 144 aircraft carrying the 504th flew over the Allied invasion fleet. Despite coordination and safety corridors, the nervous naval gunners, exhausted from earlier German air raids, mistook the American transports for enemy bombers. One gun fired, triggering a chain reaction that lit up the night sky. It was a slaughter. The slow-moving C-47s were torn apart by friendly anti-aircraft fire. Pilots tried desperately to escape the wall of flak, but formations shattered. Inside the planes, paratroopers were killed in their seats before they could even stand up. 23 aircraft were shot down, and dozens more were heavily damaged. Over 400 casualties were reported, though many believe the number was higher. Colonel Tucker's own plane was riddled with thousands of bullet holes, yet he miraculously survived. Fewer than 550 men assembled at the objective the next morning. The regiment had been broken before engaging the enemy. However, the survivors emerged with a dark, cynical hardness. They learned that death could come from anywhere, even from friends. This disaster transformed them. Scattered groups of paratroopers, angry and isolated, wreaked havoc behind German lines, cutting communications and ambushing convoys. They proved that, even in chaos, the airborne soldier was a lethal fighting force. The tragedy of Sicily taught them self-reliance that would define their war. 2 months after the Sicily disaster, the 504th was called upon to save the Allied invasion of Italy at Salerno. The beachhead was collapsing under heavy German counterattacks, and there was a real fear that the Allies would be pushed back into the sea. General Mark Clark, desperate for reinforcements, ordered the paratroopers to drop directly onto the beachhead behind friendly lines. This time, strict fire discipline was enforced, and the drop was a success. Guided by barrels of burning gasoline, 1,300 men landed and immediately moved to the front. The battle for the high ground at Altavilla became legendary. The village controlled the area, and the Germans had turned it into a fortress. The fighting was savage. Paratroopers advanced across open ground under withering machine gun and artillery fire. Companies were reduced to the size of platoons, and platoons to squads. The battle devolved into hand-to-hand combat in the streets, with men using bayonets and fists when ammunition ran dry. During the height of the battle, a staff officer suggested Colonel Tucker should retreat to a better defensive position. Tucker's response echoed through history. "Retreat, hell! Send me my other battalion." The 504th took Altavilla and held it against repeated German assaults. This engagement proved that the paratroopers were not just raiders, but heavy infantry capable of breaking fortified positions. They had saved the beachhead, earning the respect of the entire army. In January 1944, the Allies launched Operation Shingle at Anzio to break the stalemate in Italy. The 504th came ashore by sea this time, expecting a quick advance on Rome. Instead, hesitant Allied leadership allowed the Germans to rush in reinforcements, turning Anzio into a siege. The paratroopers found themselves in a static defensive war along the Mussolini Canal, a situation they were never trained for. Conditions were appalling, reminiscent of World War I. The men lived in waterlogged foxholes, freezing in the winter mud. Trench foot crippled hundreds, and malaria spread through the flooded marshlands. German artillery controlled the high ground, raining shells down constantly. There was no safe place. Anzio Annie, a massive railway gun, fired 500-pound shells that obliterated anything they hit. The psychological strain was immense. Men who had survived Sicily and Salerno began to crack from the ceaseless bombardment and lack of sleep. Despite the misery, the 504th refused to be passive targets. They adapted. While other units hunkered down, Colonel Tucker ordered aggressive action. They would not wait for the Germans to attack. They would take the fight to the enemy. This decision to remain on the offensive, even while defending, is what shifted the psychological balance of the battle. The legend of the Devils was born in the night patrols of Anzio. Every night, small teams of paratroopers blackened their faces with cork, taped their dog tags to ensure silence, and slipped across the canal into German territory. They carried knives, grenades, and a terrifying willingness to engage in close-quarters combat. They didn't just scout. They hunted. They kidnapped prisoners for interrogation, slashed the tires of supply trucks, and slit the throats of sentries. The Germans were baffled and terrified. Their secure positions were constantly breached by silent killers who vanished before dawn. The distinctive silhouette of the American paratrooper, with the large cargo pockets on their trousers, became a symbol of doom for the German infantry. This is when the baggy pants description began to circulate among the enemy ranks. The psychological impact was devastating. German soldiers became paranoid, firing at shadows and losing faith in their own defenses. The diary entry found on the dead officer was not an isolated sentiment. It reflected a widespread fear. By refusing to act like a besieged force, the 504th dominated the no-man's land, proving that morale and aggression could counter superior numbers and artillery. They owned the night. In February 1944, the Germans launched a massive counteroffensive to destroy the Anzio beachhead. 36 battalions, supported by tanks, hammered the Allied lines. A breakthrough seemed imminent. The 504th was thrown into the breach to plug a critical gap. H Company, reduced to just 25 men and 2 officers, was sent into the unknown. Led by Lieutenant James Megellas, a Greek-American officer who would become the division's most decorated soldier, the tiny force stumbled directly into a German advance. Outnumbered and cut off from support, Megellas ordered his men to dig in along a railroad embankment. For 24 hours, these 27 men held off wave after wave of German infantry. They were short on food, water, and ammunition, but they possessed an unyielding spirit. They fought until their weapons jammed and their grenades were gone. Yet they did not retreat. By the time reinforcements arrived, H Company had stopped the German advance in their sector with only a single casualty. This action, along with others by the regiment, halted the German drive to the sea. They had held the line when it mattered most. The 504th spent 63 days at Anzio, suffering tremendous casualties, but they left the beachhead with a reputation that was now known across Europe. After missing D-Day to recover from their losses, the 504th returned to action in September 1944 for Operation Market Garden in Holland. Their mission was to seize key bridges, but the operation stalled at the city of Nijmegen. The massive highway bridge over the Waal River had to be taken to relieve British forces trapped at Arnhem. A frontal assault failed. General Gavin ordered a desperate flanking maneuver. The 504th would cross the 400-yard-wide river in broad daylight, in flimsy canvas boats, directly into German fire. It was a suicide mission. The boats, supplied by the British, were fragile and lacked paddles. The paratroopers had to row with rifle butts in their hands. As they launched into the swift current, German artillery and machine guns turned the river into a slaughterhouse. Men were torn apart in the boats. Others drowned. Half of the first wave was killed or wounded. Yet those who reached the far bank didn't stop to regroup. Fueled by rage and adrenaline, they charged the German bunkers, wet and screaming. They overwhelmed the defenders through sheer ferocity. A British officer watching the assault called it the most gallant thing he had ever seen. The 504th captured the bridge, a feat considered impossible by military standards. Although the operation ultimately failed to save the British at Arnhem, the Waal River crossing remains one of the finest examples of infantry courage in history. The regiment's rest was cut short in December 1944 by the Battle of the Bulge. Trucked into the freezing Ardennes with little winter gear, they were thrown against the elite SS Panzer troops of Kampfgruppe paper. At the village of Chenus, the 504th faced their heaviest fire of the war. They attacked across open ground against 20mm flak wagons and tanks, advancing without air support or armor. The fighting was brutal. Paratroopers cleared houses room by room, finding frozen civilians trapped in cellars. They engaged in hand-to-hand combat in the snow, eventually forcing the SS to abandon their vehicles and flee on foot. The conditions rivaled the misery of Anzio. Temperatures far below zero, frostbite, and no hot food. Yet, the Devils held the northern shoulder of the Bulge, helping to strangle the German offensive. As the war wound down, the 504th pushed into Germany and liberated the Waal concentration camp. There, the hardened warriors broke down. They found skeletons stacked like firewood and living prisoners who were little more than ghosts. Lieutenant Megellas later said the sight justified every sacrifice they had made. It was a grim reminder of the evil they had been fighting to destroy. When the war in Europe ended, the 82nd Airborne was chosen as the occupation force in Berlin, earning the title America's Guard of Honor. General Patton stated they were the best he had ever seen. But for the men of the 504th, their original nickname, the Devils in Baggy Pants, remained their true identity. Men like Ross Carter, who wrote the acclaimed memoir Those Devils in Baggy Pants, ensured the story would not be forgotten. They returned home to ordinary lives, hiding the scars of Sicily, Anzio, and the Waal River. Colonel Tucker, the reckless leader who loved his men, eventually became a major general. James Megellas lived to be 103, finally laid to rest at Arlington in 2020. Today, the 504th remains active at Fort Liberty, carrying the lineage of those who fought in 1944. Modern paratroopers still study the diary of that German officer. The lesson remains unchanged. Superior firepower and numbers cannot defeat soldiers who refuse to be beaten. The German officer was right to be afraid. He understood that the men in the baggy pants would strike. They would hold, and they would never stop coming.